Welcome everyone to the July meeting of the House Bill 737 PFAS Commission. My name is Rosemary Rung. I'm chair of this commission. I'm going to call the meeting to order at 10:02. And I want to thank Mr. Bedazian for recording the minutes of the last meeting. I'm actually going to do it today because I was going to put it off on Ms. Costello, but she's unable to join us. So thankfully, the meeting's recorded, so I can go back and look at my notes. So the first order of business is approval of the May minutes. If you remember, we didn't have those completed in time to give adequate review, and I hope all of you had that chance to look them over. So I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
There's one correction.
Yeah. Can anybody move the minutes to the floor? Do I have a motion?
Okay. I will make that motion.
Okay, moved by Mr. Bedazian. I'm just going to make notes of this since I'm doing the minutes. Is there a second? A second by Mr. Dunn. Are there any corrections to the minutes or additions or deletions? Ms. Allen.
Yes, just a minor correction. Under the policy bills listed, in parentheses, it credits the sponsor of the bill. HB 478 should read Mooney. It reads Boyd currently. He's not a co-sponsor on that particular bill.
Okay, Mooney instead of Boyd. Okay, great, got it. Are there any other changes to the May minutes? Okay, all those in favor of approving the minutes as amended with the addition or the substitution of Representative Mooney for Boyd, please raise your hand so I can see. Okay, the minutes pass. Are there any, yeah, they'll just pass. And then we're going to move on to the June minutes. Is there a motion to accept the June minutes? Moved by Mr. Dunn. Is there a second? Seconded by Ms. Allen. Are there any changes or corrections? I did receive a correction from Ms. Mesmer, she's not able to join us, but she emailed me that correction. Let me read it to you.
Mindy's on.
Oh, Mindy, are you on? Oh, okay.
She's having a commission meeting at 11 as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm joining that meeting.
Okay.
So the changes that were recommended is to add a line. I believe it's under the DES update. It'll read, with regard to the rebate program for private wells impacted by PFAS contamination, Mr. Wimsatt further advised that the $5 million award from the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund previously approved by the Advisory Commission is going before both Governor and Council and the Fiscal Committee next week. Provided that it is approved by both Governor and Council and the Fiscal Committee, New Hampshire DES hopes to be launching that program as promptly as possible and taking applications by the end of the summer. So that would be in addition to the June minutes. Are there any other corrections or changes to those minutes? Yes, Ms. Mesmer.
I just had a question. There was a reference to a June 4th letter sent by DES to Saint-Gobain that I believe in June at our June meeting, but I don't know if we were provided a copy of that letter, and I searched all over One Stop, which I'm not always adept at, and couldn't find it. So I didn't know if we can add that to the minutes or not, a copy of that letter.
Yeah, yeah, we could do that if there's a, Mr. Wimsatt, do you have a copy of that letter?
Yeah, I can find a link to that and provide that to you.
Okay. All right, so we're going to add the paragraph and the link to the June 4th letter. I just have to take notes because I'm doing the minutes today, so, okay, great. Okay, any other changes? Okay, all those in favor of the June minutes as amended, please raise your hand. Okay, great, it passes. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is I've asked Ms. Allen to give an update on the National PFAS Conference. She attended, as well as Ms. Murphy and myself. And also Dr. Patali from DES attended and actually gave a presentation on PFAS his study on the PFAS in New Hampshire fish. So Ms. Allen, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. So the third annual PFAS meeting took place June 15th to 17th in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I want to give you a brief background on this because it's quite amazing. And I think there are people here who may not be familiar. So in 2017, the first National PFAS Conference took place in Boston. At that point, Brandon Kiernan came and presented the DES GIS mapping that he had started, and DES was just getting into the weeds at that point, as you know. And we were one of the first states to really do the testing that we did. And he did a presentation, and I presented the community perspective and the Merrimack and surrounding community stories. So that particular conference was born out of, you're all familiar with the situation at Pease in Portsmouth. So Andrew Amico and parents there were the first ones to really say, what just happened here? You know, our babies were drinking this water. We have no idea, what does this mean to us? So from 2014, 15, when they discovered this, through the present, there's been a series across the nation of communities who wake up one day to find out that the water that they believed was safe is problematic. So as you know, we have a local citizens group in Merrimack, and Londonderry now has a Londonderry Concerned Citizens Group. So our group in 2017 was one of the first in the nation to co-found the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. So what that is a nationwide group of community members. So it's real grassroots. So we're the folks, as you know, if you've seen Nancy and myself driving people nuts for years, right, back in the beginning, who really in the beginning said, okay, we're being told there's not enough information about these chemicals, and we know we've had long-term exposure. We understand that people in charge of the state have a lot to do, but we wanted more information. So we went out there trying to find the information, and there were people all over the nation who've gone through this process, and lo and behold, we found each other, and some of us found each other at this conference in 2017, and it was quite amazing. We decided to have lunch together, and I remember looking at a couple folks from Parkersburg, West Virginia, and other places that I knew had stories that just made my skin crawl, and I said, geez, you know, across the nation, they have these you know, political groups that get together and build power, and that's not really my thing. I have no idea about all of that, but look at who's in the room here. Let's get together and let's find a way to join our voices so we can impact change on a federal level, because we know from our state, and every state is the same, if the state has to use its own resources, develop its own knowledge base, do its own science, it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and you all know, you know, a lot of legislators on this Zoom know that everything gets budgeted and appropriated, and it's complex, right? I've learned over the last few years, there's way more that goes into government than I ever thought. So we partnered with academics. At that point, the real push was coming from the Boston area, Northeastern, Harvard, Boston University, URI got involved, and then that spread. So academics from across the nation decided, hey, we have wealths of knowledge that nobody's really asking us about, and you guys want more knowledge. So together, we formed this phenomenal relationship. Legal folks kind of jumped in. Rob Ballot said, hey, I want to really be part of this. Linda Birnbaum at that point was heading the National Institute for Toxicology and something else in the title. She said, this is really important. I want to show my research. And 2 years later, in 2019, a second conference took place in Boston. So the point of both of those conferences was to bring the answers, to bring the latest science, which is not always definitive. Sometimes there are things that are associative and not definitive, and to bring in issues over what states need, what's going on with policy, what's happening with remediation technology, what's happening with health and health impacts and health studies. So every aspect of PFAS you can imagine. And what's really amazing about this series of conferences is front and center on every panel is a community group member to give the community perspective. So the community perspective, as you know, it's driven a lot of the work in New Hampshire, right? It really has. And as people become educated and do their own work and reach out, they really can be part of the solution. So we decided this year, this was postponed because it was to take place and this thing called COVID came along. So we decided to move this out of New England and go down to Wilmington, North Carolina. The reason for that was in the Cape Fear area, the Fayetteville Chamois plant, which used to be DuPont, is right there. So the chemicals, that's the epicenter of PFAS manufacturing for the chemical, not the use of the chemical, is what we have in New England. And we decided that would be really great. And we also knew that there were areas of the country that had people that maybe hadn't come up to New Hampshire. And maybe what we would do is over the last couple of years, they've been reaching out to other community members in other states and saying, hey, how's your state making progress? You know, here's what's going on in my state. So we put on the panels this year, folks that really hadn't been heard from, folks that were, I don't want to say newer to the game as in the last month or two, but at least since 2019 and some sooner, to really have their stories on record, their information, and their points of relevancy. So this covered everything from, you know, environmental justice, blood testing, medical monitoring. I'm looking quickly at the agenda. Fertility, maternal, infant, and child health outcomes was one panel. There's always a really emotional and intense discussion when we talk about breastfeeding and PFAS, because when you breastfeed, the mother can excrete and lower her body burden, but the infant who's little is getting PFAS exposure at triple the mother's blood serum. Yet the science says, you know, the benefits of breastfeeding outweigh the risks. So I understand that scientifically, but there is the emotional impact to the mothers to be considered. So there was panels on cancer, dietary exposure pathways in fish and game, livestock. We heard some very emotional testimony from some really gruff big guys who are usually pretty cool when I see them, who were in the military and firefighting. And they told, you know, what they've observed and what their needs are. John presented about some of the work on fish testing and things like that. So there was a lot there. We got into the waste stream and waste and remediation. So I think if you just look up PFAS Feeding North Carolina, I'm looking for a link, you'll be able to see the agenda. And PFASproject.com, I've mentioned that before, that's housed down in Northeastern. They will have overview of slides on there if you want to take a look. They will have links to whoever gave permission for video is on there, and there's lots of great information. At the end, well, the very beginning, you know, the welcome introductions were done by, we invited Radhika Fox from the EPA to come. She's with the Water Division and she's here in Region 1. And the EPA decided to really bring it. The EPA decided, instead of just doing what they've done in the past, talking about the roadmap and what they're going to do, they announced some very definitive actions, which I'm sure you've all heard by now in the media. And they laid out the health advisories, you know, for 4 of the PFAS. And in September, they start the rulemaking for at least PFOA and PFOS. So we'll hear what they do with that. So it was really stunning. We know from what we've read, and I think everybody here in official capacity has heard from the people on the ground, when you find out you're exposed to these chemicals, you kind of go into this mode, like the more you learn and the more you look around your streets and you see the impacts and you say to yourself, I don't care what number you tell me is safe or isn't safe. I don't want these chemicals in my water. So the EPA really validated folks. They're pulling the science out at this point and they're doing their own science instead of, you know, depending on industry science. And what they did say is they brought up this parts per quadrillion, which had me really think about how many zeros that was, but then they translated it to parts per trillion, which we're all familiar with at this point. So, you know, what they said is the health advisory, which is, as you know, up until recently has been 70 parts per trillion, right? Here in New Hampshire for PFOA, our state says 12 parts is where you're going to see harm. The federal government has been lingering on that 70 parts. That's a huge difference. So they come out and they say 0.004, not even 0.04, PFOA is their health advisory and 0.02 PFOS. So what struck me about that is the first thought that I had was, well, geez, non-detect is 4 parts per trillion. You can't even test that low. And then I thought to myself, oh, what they're saying is there's no safe level of PFOA and PFOS in your drinking water. And that, I know that. I can't prove it, but in my heart, in my gut, I know that. And a lot of you know that too. But hearing that from Radhika Fox I was sitting next to Andrea, I was sitting next to Nancy and Rosemary, and my throat kind of choked up. I mean, I think Nancy did too. It was really stunning just to hear that. It really was. They put in some advisories also for PFBS and Gen-X. And Gen-X is Gen-X chemicals. So, you know, that was pretty intense. So at the end of the conference, there were breakout sessions, and they were about health monitoring. There was some excellent ones. Exactly. And the breakout sections really came from community members across the nation who were asked, what do you need? What do you need to get into the weeds with at the end of this conference? And who do you need to present that panel? Who do you want to hear from? And what do you want to know? So we all gave our feedback. And there was about 6 breakout sessions that were a good 90 minutes. So there was ample time for the presenter to kind of give an overview and then Q&As. So I attended the EPA breakout session, and my burning question was, hey, I wanted to see exactly, you know, I've seen John, you know, walk us through all the, you know, the dose frequencies and the equations and the math and all those complex things of how they derive the MCLs. So I wanted to see the flow chart of how they did it. I wanted to see what their critical endpoints are and what their defined most vulnerable, critical, sensitive population is. That's how we do these things. And I asked some questions. One of the questions I asked is, you know, of course, a health advisory is not an MCL. You cannot set an MCL for less than you test for. So these will not be MCLs. But what's going on with the other branches of government, in particular ATSDR, which gave us our health consultation, is utilizing the higher levels. And are they going to update them? You know, where is the coordination between branches in government, and where are you going with this? So looking at their science and looking at how they derive these numbers, I could see that these MCLs are going to be considerably lower than people are realizing. And they did assure that the ATSDR is going to incorporate, you know, they're leading the show at this point, and it's all going to be pulled together in a very short order of time, which kind of impressed me because we know these things take time, and we know that, you know, government doesn't move as quickly as folks like me would like. So thank you for all of you for, you know, doing the work that you do, because I know it's time consuming. So that's a general overview. There was some good work on the waste stream, you know, PFAS in biosolids, or neighbors to the North Main. You've heard about this farmer, Fred Stone. He came. He doesn't often get out there. That's not what he does. I could tell, being in front of people and talking about this, he was really feeling very protective of his cows. He's generations of dairy farmers who, the cows are their family, is what really struck me. And having to put down a lot of his herd and having to stop doing the work that he did because of the land spreading. And a man from Unity, Maine, who purchased with his partner an organic farm a number of years ago, not that many years ago, who found out that the water in the soil is not what he counted on. He is now saying, I need to go around and talk to farmers and do something about this. So he's become somewhat of an activist, but he's a rather introverted person who really would be out in the fields. So seeing him really called to action was both powerful and emotional. You know, we had a couple of talks, and we're meeting up later this month in Maine, and he was a lovely man, but he was really, you know, blown away by all of this. And they're really focusing on, you know, the end game, you know, the downstream, as we call it, of PFAS. So, you know, the long and short of it is, we have the upstream, we have the polluters, we have the needs we need to stop the source, we have the remediation that we're all dealing with in our communities, the cost to communities in terms of health and in terms of, you know, supplying clean water, the role of polluter, how much are they going to pay, how much are they not going to pay, and then this piece about people, well, what does this mean to me, and the emotional, you know, and the stress component, and how it all comes together technology, destruction technology, you know, is being looked at, and every aspect of this was presented. So that's a, you know, just a casual, general conversational, I think a conversational overview is what I've just done with you to give you a feel of what that was like. I hope I captured a bit of it. And
Thank
if you
you
go,
very much. Yeah, thank you
PFAS
very much, Ms. Allen. I just want to kind of keep us moving here. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Dr. Wood.
Just in view of the comments you made relative to what the EPA is doing, which is very encouraging. By the same token, was there any discussion or concern about the SCOTUS's Supreme Court's decision relative to the EPA and the potential impact for this activity, not just the oil industry, but this as well? Was there a discussion along those lines?
at that point, here we are in mid-June, right? And here we are at the beginning of July, and a lot has changed, and you're absolutely right. They did not consider that at all. There was no talk of this. And then the West Virginia decision came in, limiting the scope of the EPA over directing, what is it, the coal plants and the impact, the environment and all that. So when that decision came out, I had a bad feeling about that decision. A lot of people are feeling very good about it. And I'm going, no, I can see what's happening. So we have this philosophy in the Supreme Court that we can see clearly, which is it doesn't matter what topic we're talking about, is we're going to, you know, minimize the role of the federal government and keep the power in the states. So when I saw that decision about West Virginia about a week and a half ago, that really gave me pause. So you're right. The EPA has been real clear about doing work very carefully. Michael Reagan came out last fall to Merrimack. We invited him, and I tweeted an invite to him. He accepted it, and some of us were there. And he was real clear about doing work in a way that it would stand up to legal scrutiny. So at that point, I assumed he was talking about chemical manufacturers. Perhaps he was talking about, you know, courts. So I don't know, but right, it really does give me pause. And we know in New Hampshire, you know, as soon as we enacted the MCLs, boom, we were sued, but the judge prevailed that the science was sound, but whose job is it? Yeah,
Okay,
the EPA needs to be able to do their job, plain and simple,
Are
right?
there any other questions for Ms. Allen? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Allen. I appreciate it. I think we have a pretty short legislative update. We're just about done. Representative Mooney?
There we go. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, commissioners, and happy birthday to Dr. Woods. Consider this your second surprise party.
Yeah, right.
Very brief but important legislative update as we near the end of the session. And I just want to highlight just how successful, looking at the chart again, this session has been, and the collaboration between the commission, the DES, legislators in the Senate and the House, community activists, has really been outstanding this session. So my report focuses on 3 bills. House Bill 1185, the first one, prime sponsored by Representative Rung, and that was related to the treatment of water contaminated with PFAS chemicals. That was signed by the governor on July 1st, 2022, with an effective date upon passage. That's House Bill 1185. Next, I want to highlight House Bill 1546. That was prime sponsored by Representative Boyd, related to airborne PFAS in certain circumstances. That was signed by the governor on June 17th, 2022, with an effective date of January 1st, 2023. Lastly, House Bill 1547. That's prime sponsored by myself as well as others. And that's related to PFAS remediation in soil, as well as the hazardous waste generators, as well as a $25 million appropriation to the PFAS remediation loan fund. That bill has not been signed yet. However, I received an update this morning that it went from the Secretary of State's office to the governor's office on July 5th. So the 5-day window for the governor to act or not is in progress. So we should be getting an update on that bill very soon, possibly even today, since that window is active now.
Great,
All
thank
right.
you. Are there any, that's great news, Representative Mooney, thank you. Are there any questions or comments for Representative Mooney? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Moving on, DES update. Mr. Wimsatt, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So the update for DES, as it was a very eventful month, as Lorraine Allen indicated, and both in terms of specific things happening relative to the site, but also on the national front. So on June 3rd, the department received a letter from Saint-Gobain that included sampling addendum 15. And following on a letter from May 4th that we sent requesting additional sampling, they did agree to sample an additional 110 wells within the consent decree area, including some that were within the previously identified buffer areas around other potential sources of PFAS. So also the letter, our letter indicated that, or their letter indicated that they believe they'll have sufficient data to apply for a groundwater management permit in accordance with the time frame that was established in our previous letter. So that date is actually August 26th, I believe. So they're due to get us an application for a groundwater management permit, which will lay out their proposal for monitoring groundwater, both on the site proper, but also in the impact area and those permits are reviewed and established for a 5-year period, but they're renewable. And the expectation would be that this site will have a groundwater management permit associated with it for many, many years to come. So also on June 23rd, both the department and the Department of Justice completed its review of Saint-Gobain's April 29th submittal, which included following on our April 18th agreement with the company. They had to, by the end of April, propose alternate water remedies for all the remaining properties inside the consent decree that were determined to be above standards. They did submit that on the 29th, and we reviewed that. And then on June 23rd, we reached agreement and put out a notice. And there were actually an additional, somewhere on the order of over 700 properties. So initially, there were about 350 properties that were identified for either a point of entry treatment system or a drinking water line connection when we originally announced the agreement back in April. And then subsequently with this new one, we basically, if you look at the agreement in toto, now that the scope of the agreement has been finalized, there are a total of 1,134 properties that have been identified for either a point of entry treatment system or connection to a water line. And I'll just very briefly go through what that means in each of the impacted towns. So in Bedford, and again, this is not the total, we already talked about the 353. So this new group of about 700 plus would sum up or shake out as follows. So in the Bedford area, there were an additional 222 properties that were identified to receive point of entry treatment systems. In Hudson, there were 3 properties identified for poets. In Litchfield, there were 21 properties identified for poets and 1 water line connection. In Londonderry, in the southern area to the west of High Range Road, there were point of entry treatment systems identified for 171 properties. And then in the northern portion on the west side of High Range Road, there were basically 352 properties that were identified for connection to water lines. And then in Merrimack, there were an additional 7 properties identified for point of entry treatment systems. So that summarizes the notice that we put out on the 23rd of June. And so following on that, now that work needs to happen. So on June 29th, we received from the company a work plan for installation of the POET systems at the identified properties, and we have that plan is under review by the department right now. Saint-Gobain has indicated that they hope to go out to bid for POET contractors in July this month, and they would hope to award 1 or more contracts by the end of August for the vendors who will actually provide those services to install and maintain point of entry treatment systems in the homes that have been identified. And so on June 30th, Saint-Gobain, as was promised in the original agreement, sent out letters to the original 350 properties that had solutions identified at the time of the first announcement back in April 18th. So they sent letters out to all those homeowners to talk about what the next steps would be for either setting them up for a point of entry treatment system or to explain what would be happening on the development and design of waterline systems and waterline connections. We anticipate that for these additional 700 plus properties that I just described, that similar letters will go out to those properties in the coming week or two. That's what we're understanding from the company. On July 1st, we met with Saint-Gobain to discuss proposed interim measures to address what have been these longstanding issues and concerns with delays in bottled water deliveries to the folks who are on bottled water. And I'm happy to report that they've informed us that they're working to finalize a contract with an additional vendor to help. Right now they have Monadnock Spring Water, which has struggled mightily as a result of, really, I think it may be as much about supply chain and getting, employees to drive trucks as it is anything else. But they really struggled to make those deliveries in a timely way. So they're looking to bring an additional contractor on. There'll be some lead time to get them up and running and get some of these folks transferred to a new service under a new vendor. But in the meantime, they also are reaching out to town governments to set up temporary bottled water pickup locations, perhaps at like the town transfer stations or other town properties, where if someone gets in a jam and they can't get a delivery on time, they would at least have the opportunity to go to a local, a fairly nearby location within their town to collect some bottled water. So hopefully that will help to take some of the sting out of this, take some of the pressure off. So we're hopeful that that will improve on that. And of course, in the end of the day, we want these folks to have alternate water, either through treatment or water line connections, so they won't need to have bottled water delivered to their homes. On the issue of water supply well sampling, as I said, we did receive a 15th addendum, which identifies another 110 properties for sampling. That hasn't been sort of incorporated into the bi-monthly update that we get from Saint-Gobain. So the numbers I'm going to read to you now don't include the addendum 15, and none of the addendum 15 properties have yet been sampled. So these numbers are really what has happened since addendum 15 or leading up to addendum 15. So there are 3,691 properties that were identified for sampling, and that's the same as the June report. There are 3,682 access agreements that have been sent out, and that represents about a 68%, or the return rate on those is about 68%. And that's 91 more than the June report. There are 2,276 samples that have been collected from water supply wells, and that's 55 more than the June report. And then a total of 991 properties have been offered bottled water, and that's 16 more than the June report. So moving on to site investigation, Saint-Gobain's consultant, as I reported earlier, will be conducting the stormwater sampling that's required. And the timing of that is really just dependent on storm events this spring and under the requirements of the approved work plan. So we would expect that to happen soon once we get an appropriate weather event that they can schedule it for. The remedial action plan is due to DES 120 days from the date that after Saint-Gobain's consultant receives analytical results from the stormwater sampling. So that date is uncertain at this point and will be determined once the stormwater sampling is completed and they receive the data on that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a groundwater permit application is due to the agency by August 26th. So about a little less than 2 months from now. Happy to report the update on the rebate program is that, as indicated in the earlier minutes, as proposed for amendment by Mindy, we did go to GNC and fiscal during June, and we did get approval from both of those bodies for the $5 million to accept the $5 million in drinking water groundwater trust fund funds to implement the rebate program. We do anticipate program launch by the end of the summer. So that is on target. Also, we'll note, as Lorene mentioned in her remarks, US EPA on June 15th did issue interim updated health advisories for both PFOA and PFOS, as described by Lorene. And they also issued final health advisories for GenX and PFBS. I want to talk a little bit about the advisories for PFOA and PFOS. So the advisories state essentially that concentrations above these levels in drinking water may pose an increased health risk. The term interim, as we understand it, means that the peer review process for the PFOA and the PFOS advisories is not yet complete, and that the values have not been, so and therefore the values haven't been published as final values. US EPA has not publicly responded to recommendations from the Science Advisory Board regarding its assessment of the science with regard to those two compounds. So that's why these have been identified as interim standards. EPA does state that it will propose draft drinking water standards, or MCLs, for those two compounds by the end of this year. So we're very interested to see where that comes. You know, if we certainly don't want to be in the business of prognosticating, but based on what we know about how MCLs are determined and proposed, it's likely that we don't know what other considerations they may have, but if they just look at the health advisories, and if those were considered to be final, they would look at those and say, well, they're well below the detection limit. And so what they'll often do when they're setting an MCL is go to what they perceive as the minimum detection limit or minimum reporting limit for these compounds, which right now, at least the labs that we're dealing with, we see reporting limits around 1.8 parts per trillion for these compounds. EPA, I think in their remarks on the notice, mentioned the number of 4 parts per trillion is what they saw as reporting limits. So we're thinking that when they may land on that, and again, it's dangerous to prognosticate, but we think that if we were to guess on it, they'd be somewhere in that 2 to 4 parts per trillion level for proposing an MCL. And again, that doesn't consider yet what they might consider for information about financial impacts or feasibility or what have you. So, and I don't know where they'll go on that, but obviously the agency will be very interested to be watching very closely to see where they land on that. I would note that, you know, in the wake of these announcements, EPA's recommendations to the public were, you know, that should continue to sample public water systems and assess the data, notify the public about the presence of PFAS in their drinking water, reduce PFOA and PFOS levels in drinking water, and identify and eliminate sources of PFAS. And, you know, I guess I would be happy to say that, you know, DES and its partners and the members of this commission have all been working collaboratively very hard to implement all of those recommendations. So I think while it's very, you know, upsetting to hear that these levels are really being lowered to, you know, concern that much lower levels than previously indicated by EPA may pose a health risk, it is encouraging to know that I think if you look across the states, New Hampshire has done very well in trying to implement those recommendations really over the last 6 to 8 years, not just, you know, this year or in the wake of this announcement. So with that sort of covers, I think, the news and the work related to the agency from standpoint of looking at drinking water and water sampling. I want to now give an Air Division update, and then that'll conclude my remarks. So from the Air Division, on December 28th, Saint-Gobain submitted an application requesting a significant permit amendment to their existing temporary permit regarding installation and operation of the bypass stack. And they submitted both a confidential and a redacted air permit application on that, which is to say there's one version of the application which includes some business confidential information, and then they submit for public review a redacted copy, which is the same document with those portions of it that are determined to be business confidential redacted. So that is available. They also, and that application was submitted on February 28th with a more thorough monitoring plan that addressed the thermal oxidizer and the bypass stack usage, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. So DES deemed that application administratively complete in a letter dated April 15th. Now, the temporary permit is scheduled to expire by the end of August. And so on June 1st, the company submitted an application for the issuance of an initial state permit to operate. Since the application was received 90 days prior to the expiration date of the temporary permit, there's a provision in our rules called application shield, which basically, or permit shield, which basically says their temporary permit continues to be valid until that application is acted on. So even though it technically would expire prior to then. So I just want to, that's just a provision in our rules that means that as long as somebody gets an application in 90 days before their permit's due to expire, then they have, the permit continues until we act on the new permit application. On June 27th, we sent a letter to Saint-Gobain deeming that application administratively complete. And that means that they can continue to operate under the conditions of that temporary permit until we make a final decision on the application. So inspection activities on January 6th, DES conducted an inspection of the facility to review records associated with the operation of the RTO, the frequency and duration of bypass operations, and the RTO temperature records since the startup of the device in July of 2021. We issued a partial compliance evaluation report on June 20th. And on June 22nd, and per our request, the company submitted supplemental information related to bypass operations and the operations of the oxidizer below the minimum temperature requirement contained in the permit. During the first 8 months of operation, from July of 21 to April of 22, when the RTO was in its initial shakedown period, Saint-Gobain reported 45 hours of bypass. And during the past 2 months, from April to June, they reported an additional 6 hours of bypass for a total of 51 hours since the oxidizer was put in service a year ago. As far as reporting activities go, Saint-Gobain has continued to submit monthly monitoring plan reports as required in the temporary permit and rainwater study results as were required under the consent decree. And these documents, there'll be a link in my remarks that'll go in the minutes to obtain and take a look at those documents. The most recent monthly monitoring plan letter from the company is dated June 9th. And we issued a letter on June 16th approving the final air pollution control equipment monitoring plan, which allows the company to discontinue submittal of the monthly monitoring plan updates. The idea being is that because they didn't have an approved monitoring plan, we looked for any updates or changes they were making on a monthly basis. Now that the monitoring plan has been approved, they don't have to submit those updates anymore. And the most recent rainwater study letter is dated June 30th, and it reflects samples taken in May. The results from that sampling and analysis indicate that measurements were below detection levels for almost all PFAS analytes. For a few analytes, there were some values that were estimated between the detection and the reporting levels, and so they were J-flagged, basically saying that you can't be confident about the concentration because while we're confident that it was detected, it wasn't detected at a concentration that was where the lab could reliably quantify and be confident that the concentration they're reporting was accurate. And so that's what I have for an update. I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wimsatt. Are there any questions for Mr. Wimsatt? Ms. Mesmer?
Thank you. So are there any plans? You know, there have been a lot of people that have received their results from Saint-Gobain's consultant for their drinking water wells, and many of those now are above what we think that EPA is going to say. Is there going to be any effort made to notify those homeowners that the EPA, just to let you know, this is what EPA is moving toward, and you know your water is above that level?
Yeah, I mean, at present, in terms of our actions on that data, we're not, you know, we're still observing the standards that are part of New Hampshire law, the AGQS and the MCLs for both PFOA and PFOS. I think I would, if it hasn't happened already, I would hazard to say we would probably change the language in our letters to include information about the interim health advisories that EPA has issued, just in order to at least make people aware that that's out there.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Wimsatt? Mr. Dunn?
I just have a quick question about, you had mentioned that as far as water delivery, they were gonna try to do town-specific locations. Has anyone reached out to the towns yet? Is there anything that I can do to expedite that or help on that? Because I talked to Jeff Martz back on the 27th, and I told him right now in Londonderry, there's about a 5-week delay. And he had said to me he gave me an 800 number to reach out to people if they needed water and they'd bring it to their house for Golder. I just didn't know if there was anything that I could do to help you out with that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, again, this news about, is fairly recent. That my understanding is they're already making efforts to reach out to town governments to make arrangements for this. And I don't have detailed information about how that's going, but my understanding from the conversation we had with Chris Angier just a couple of days ago is that that was going well, and they would expect to be able to get those temporary locations set up in each of the towns. On the more encouraging side, the idea that they're getting a second vendor on board is really encouraging to me. And I think that it's going to take a few weeks to kind of get that all set up, the logistics of transferring certain people from one vendor to another and getting them incorporated into a route. My understanding is I'm not really sure, they may be on the order of taking on maybe 20 new customers a week, just because that's sort of what they can handle in terms of setting up new accounts. So that could take a little while to get that resolved, but my hope is that when we get a couple months out here, we're going to have a much better response time on bottled water delivery. And also, our hope would be that most of those folks I guess the ones who are likely to still have some significant amount of time of bottled water delivery before them are the ones who've been identified for water line connections, because that water line design and bid work will likely happen this year. But the actual construction of those water lines and connections to those homes really won't happen until 2023. So that we still have a lot of folks who are going to be, and again, it'll also take time to get, there are several hundred folks who've been identified for POET systems, and it's going to take time for those contractors to work their way through that list. So we are hopeful that these improvements to the bottled water delivery will improve situation for people, will improve the situation for all these people. And we are very sensitive to the fact that a lot of people are waiting what is really an unacceptable amount of time. What has worked pretty well on a case-by-case basis is that when we become aware of someone who's close to running out of water and doesn't see a delivery coming, we have reached out directly. Jeff Martz has done this a number of times to St. Gobain. And what Golder's done is, in many cases, because they're working in the community anyways, they will literally go purchase water and make a delivery so that that person at least has bottled water. That's not a permanent solution. It's not a great solution, but at least we have tools available to try to deal with these situations as they arise. If I do find out anything you could do to help, I'll certainly let you know that.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Murphy?
Oh, thank you. Just have a quick question from Mike, and maybe he could explain this for the public that may watch this video later. When you mentioned the 51 hours that the RTO is offline, could you just speak about what that means for emissions into the community, and whether or not is that like an expected annual amount of time that this will happen, and 51 hours measured by St. Gobain, or is there independent confirmation that that's actually the number? Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, okay. Well, as far as the last question, I think that's as reported by the company. We don't have like a link that tells us when it's on and off. So that is it's a requirement that they monitor those things, and they do have systems in place. So we're confident that we believe that what is being reported to us is accurate. I think my understanding is, again, we're in a shakedown period here. This is the first year that this system is operated. Our expectations would be that the downtime would reduce once things get up and running, and they have a new if they get a new permit, that under a new permit and with experience under their belt working out the bugs in the system, if you will, that they would have fewer hours on an annual basis of downtime. In terms of the impact, I don't really want to comment too much on that. I mean, I think it's important to note that the chemistry they're using is not the same chemistry they were using 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So the impact of 51 hours of the oxidizer not operating is not zero, but it's not the same as it was many years ago. But obviously we want the oxidizer to be working all the time, and that's what that's what we would aim for. So again, I think probably downtime would be expected to be less in subsequent years.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Allen?
So the permit tied their emissions, the RTO has to work at levels that will, how does it say it, that do not add to the contribution of, exceeding the MCLs. So
Right.
if the MCLs federally, end up lower than New Hampshire's, and then we have their science to count on, so that gives us some strength there. What happens to the RTO permit? Because the poundage per year, right, is figured on above, that even though it's kind of silly because the groundwater is contaminated, so anything they add to it is exceeding, because we have exceeded. So what happens? What's the implication of federal MCLs on the air emissions? Because what they've done there, as we know, is they have not eliminated, they've reduced. And as you said, the current manufacturing stream is changed. It does not mean it's safer. I saw countless presentations about the C3s to C7s and what happens in the burning and what happens in different stages. And it's all troubling, and the public is saying, hey, we just don't want this. It's not so simple, but how do we keep, them kind of contained? They have a right to do what they do, but they don't have a right to pollute us. The ideal is they would do business, and I know you would agree, but it's not so simple. And they would just do what they did with no environmental impact and no further harm to our community, because the filtration, the remediation that we all pay for also is partially due to a continued flow of PFAS of some sort, the modern formula. So what happens with what you have in place for regulatory when the federal changes?
Sure. So I think under the law and the rules in New Hampshire, if a new federal drinking water MCL is established, we would adopt that. And so if we have through rulemaking adopt a new MCL that is lower, then we would have to evaluate their emissions against that new standard, and then the permit would be modified. If necessary, the permit would be modified appropriately to address that change.
That's why we really need that federal, isn't it, to really protect us. The state's done as good a job as you can, but that federal is important. One more brief question is, what happens to, I always think about the homes that haven't responded. Has there been a request of Saint-Gobain to go back and look at the current property list? Because when they formulated their work plan, it started in fall of 2019. So have you asked them at this point to say, please go back and look at those addresses and get the current property owners and contact all of them? Because I really feel I know there's a few people that we all assume that just aren't interested, but the percentage is too high to me. I think there are people who are unaware, and we hear all the time of people who just kind of heard it from a neighbor and said, what? And they really are unaware. So what can we do to make sure that they have the current property owner list, or have you done that?
Sure. Well, I think that there were, as part of their work plan, they would make multiple outreaches to property owners, and then, but obviously not an infinite number of outreaches. I think now that we've got, sort of the universe that we identified where we have sampled and they're above standards, and we now have a plan in place to provide alternate water, we can go back and look at where, that list of folks who have not responded. And I don't think it would be unreasonable to say, well, let's give one more bite at the apple at that and try to get current, information about those parcels and get another mailing out. I think that's something we could look at. I think I would also note that if we are headed towards a significantly lower standard, it kind of changes a lot of the calculus inside that consent decree area, because if the agency, as a matter of state law, changes the standards to a lower standard, then as certainly as we understand it, under the provisions of the original consent decree, Saint-Gobain has a responsibility to address properties that are impacted above what would be a new standard. So we still have a lot of work to do. As this evolves, we're going to be at this for some time, and it could certainly change the total number of properties that require some form of a remedy or an alternate water solution.
Okay, any other questions? I have a quick one, Mr. Wimsatt. When Saint-Gobain reports that they've used the bypass stack, do they give a reason for that?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I suspect they do, but I don't know. That's something that I could ask Kathy Beam and
Yeah. I was just wondering if it's how many hours are due to the RTO not functioning to maybe a regular maintenance or something like that. Okay, that's okay. I want to move along. So if there's no other questions, I'd like to turn the floor over to, thank you very much, Mr. Wimsatt, by the way. I want to turn the floor over to Dr. Bush.
Morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Always a tough act to follow with Mike. Just have a couple sort of shared updates. Never seems quite as hefty as his updates, but I have a couple that are just really reiterations from last month. I want to reassure everyone that DHHS continues to convene the cancer review team, and we do apologize that we have not been back to the commission for an update. Staff limitations and just summer are creating some challenges to get the final draft through the review process. But we are working on a draft report that summarizes all of our work to date, includes just an analysis of that cancer data. And the team is slated to meet on Monday and review that report one last time. And I would hope that we could talk about coming to the commission either in August or September, pending schedules, to share that report. It will not really have much new than what was shared at our original meeting. It will just sort of be the final summary of the work done to date. And that will really include, you know, a summary of the data analysis and recommendations for next steps, including, you know, specific next steps and recommendations for the feasibility of conducting a study in the area. I also wanted to reiterate that CDC and ATSDR, our federal partners, have released new draft guidelines for cancer and environmental concerns. So there's a summary of that in our June notes, but they can be accessed on the Federal Register, and I believe the link was included. I'll make sure all this information is in the notes again and is circulated. But they're soliciting feedback on those new guidelines, public comment, until July 25th. So I know many folks have been a part of some of the information gathering, stakeholder groups, interviews, focus groups, to provide, you know, important community perspective in the development of these guidelines. So I encourage you to take the time and submit comments if you are interested. Again, just to summarize briefly, some of the places where they've expanded these guidelines have to do with placing greater emphasis on engaging communities. So really building on the work that you all are doing in the Merrimack area. Also recommending health departments consider proactive surveillance of cancer, and just replacing the original guidelines with a more detailed set of criteria to evaluate when further study is warranted. So we certainly encourage partners and all of you to submit feedback if you're interested. And then the last thing that I wanted to share, sort of exciting news out of ATSDR, related to the PFAS health study. They are going to host a clinician webinar on July 20th, and I'll make sure that this information is also in the notes with a registration link. And while not focused on the Southern New Hampshire, it's the first time we're seeing our federal partners host a webinar aimed at clinicians in a long time, if ever. And so clinicians from across the state are welcome to attend, although it will be specific to the PFAS health study as they're getting ready to release those clinical reports and clinical results to the study participants. They have identified, you know, the need and importance of informing clinicians of those results. So if their patients are then coming to them with questions, they'll have some information. And so it's an exciting, I'd say maybe first step to see the federal agencies taking this step. And I will make sure that that information is shared so that you all can distribute it through your networks and hopefully encourage healthcare providers in the Seacoast region particularly, but also in your region where we know PFAS is also an important topic for patients to be talking with their providers. So that is on July 20th at 7 p.m. It is an ATSDR, you know, the federal partners are hosting and presenting at this. But the New Hampshire apple tree team with representatives from both the health department and environmental services will be in attendance to learn and hear and really just be a supporting partner in that work. So those were my 3 updates, really: the cancer work, the cancer guidelines, and this new clinician webinar being hosted by ATSDR later this month.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bush. Are there any questions for Dr. Bush? Yes, Ms. Allen.
Hi, I don't know what you've been hearing from community members, because when they do reach out, we kind of direct them to the cancer team and say, please call and give your information, even if it isn't specific to kidney or renal. We just have them call you. So I know you've been getting those calls. I just want to keep in mind too, what's really not on the radar in the area because of the way numbers are tabulated and everything else is childhood. And the last 2 months, I have heard of 3 additional children in our community with cancers. Including last week, that one I didn't hear. I saw a fundraiser for a 3-year-old with, a cancer, and they're very similar. And these are families that have lived in the area for a while, and sometimes their parents before them, so they're long-term residents, and it's that younger generation starting out in family life. So that's not pleasant to think about. It always gives me pause, but I just want all of us to keep that in mind. What I have seen again over and over and over, especially presentations on maternal and child and prenatal impacts of PFAS, which also covered the replacement, the short term, the ethers, the this stage or that stage, all the stuff that isn't even on the radar for regulation, to be quite honest. So these are really troubling chemicals, and we're going to continue to be exposed to one or the other. So have you heard from many folks? It's probably dropped off a bit, but maybe in the beginning you heard.
Yeah, that was my understanding, that the calls had really slowed to the program, but please do continue to point people directly to the cancer concern email or phone number. I had not heard about these sort of developing cases, so please do point them directly to that program. I will check in with folks next week at that meeting and see if they've heard anything.
It's more difficult with young ones because when an older person is a little more stable, so when you have little ones and 3-year-olds, I never reach out and say, hey, and I'm very respectful of that boundary. They're just trying to survive this. It's just horrible. And those are the families I think that are least likely to reach out because they're just trying to be there for their babies, right? So I really feel that they really are undercounted.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Allen. Any other questions for Dr. Bush? Okay, moving on. Are there any subcommittee reports? Okay, just to remind you, if you do have a subcommittee meeting, please, they don't have to be like official minutes, but please take notes. We need to keep a record of those discussions. They don't have to be lengthy, just pretty much just the topics that were discussed and any decisions that were made. Okay, seeing none, I just want to let the commission know, and I want to thank Senators Daniels and Senator Carson. We've got a new commission member who is filling the role as an environmental scientist, and that's Don Preventure from Merrimack. He's also chairperson of the Merrimack Village District. He meets the requirements. It adds somebody on. He has a very vested interest in the work we do. So he wasn't able to join us this month, but he's very excited. Also, I did send you an email earlier, shortly after the last meeting, that Amy Russo from DES, who administers the technology for this meeting, she's been putting together a website on PFAS. I'm using my power as chair to appoint her as an ex officio member of the communications subcommittee. Her expertise would be very valuable to that committee. So she doesn't have a role on the commission. She's not a commission member, but she's going to be a bona fide subcommittee member for communications. Also, if there's anyone that, any of the subcommittees feel like there is someone with a unique expertise that they would like to invite to their subcommittee meetings in that type of a role where they're a contributing subcommittee member but not a commission member, please let me know. Thank you. Next, I have on the agenda public comment, and I just want to use this agenda item that, Ms. Allen's already brought some up, but if you do hear from any community members with topics or questions that you want to share with us, this would be the time to do it. But I think we've heard already through some of the other discussions, some of the public concerns. So I'm going to move on. And as far as the August meeting, I am going to be away. I won't be returning until August 15th, I think, 14th or 15th. So I want to ask the commission for any options if we want to have a meeting later that month, if we want to cancel the meeting. Would anybody have a problem if we just had the meeting and go to the September month and not meet in August? Raise your hand if you want me to recognize you. Okay, so I know it's, oh, go ahead. All right, so that would then make our September meeting, well, it would make it on September 9th. That's the second Friday of the month, and we'll meet at 10 o'clock. So but if the subcommittees, I encourage you to still meet in August, or if you want, because what's going to happen is we're going to have to start preparing that annual report for the governor, the Senate, and the House. So we're going to be, that's due November 1st. So we're going to be using the August meeting to approve that report. So we need a draft ready for the October meeting. That means at the September meeting, our next meeting, we're going to need to discuss anything that we want included in that report. So at the September meeting, I want to have the subcommittee chairs. You're going to be on the agenda to present your recommendations for that report. So it would kind of summarize the topics of discussion you've had over the year, any legislative or non-legislative recommendations that you want to make. So each subcommittee will present those at our September 9th meeting. And then I'm going to schedule a meeting of the policy subcommittee shortly after that. It'll probably be the week after that. And those people are generally the elected officials that are on this commission. That's pretty much sums up who's on that policy committee. We will determine how those recommendations will appear, how they'll be articulated in the report. And then that'll be one policy subcommittee meeting. And then near the end of the month of September, the communications subcommittee, and maybe it will be a joint meeting with the communications committee, but we'll be doing the rough draft so that it is prepared to go to a vote in October. So I just want to impress upon you how important it is for those subcommittees to bring forth those recommendations at the September meeting, because, you know, it seems like, oh, there's a lot of time before we get to November 1st, but it really isn't a lot of time. And I remember last year, it was really stressful to get that report done on time. So I kind of don't want to go through that again. It was aging. All right, so that's that. And then, so we have our next meeting. So I can actually entertain a motion to adjourn. Anybody, Mr. Dunn moves to adjourn. Is there a second? And Ms. Allen, okay. So if there's any other comments people want to make? Okay, then all those in favor of adjourning, raise your hand. Great, we're adjourned. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. See you in September.
Happy summer.
Okay, you too.